Hello guys, welcome back. In this video, Dave's going to be installing the oil pump and then also the backing plate.
Yeah, it's a pretty easy thing to do. The oil pump goes on pretty easily. Just make sure that you do prime the pump because it's going to be dry most likely if you've just had this oil pump off for the last 30 years or the engine's been on a bench for 30 years. And then the blanking plate, that's a pretty unique item for early commandos. We'll take a look at that.
Yeah, great. Hope you'll enjoy it, guys. See you.
So moving on to the oil pump, which is one of the last things to go on here. I can see that what it appears is that the oil pump studs have been helicoiled at some point. Again, I don't know the entire history of this engine. I bought it from a friend of mine who I believe has had it sitting on his workbench for about 30 years, at least as long as I have known him. That's probably more than 30 years. And he bought it from someone and it was just in the back of a truck. So I have no idea what all the history before that was actually. It certainly has all the indications that it didn't have a lot of miles on it, but it's interesting to see a helicoil in there. Although there are probably multiple ways of holding the crankshaft in place, when you're at this stage with the pistons off, but you still got access to the connecting rods and the piston wrist pins, this is a great way to hold it. Now the workshop talks about just running a steel bar between the connecting rods and holding against the case. But as you can see here, this actually protects everything with this piece of wood. This one's based off of one I borrowed from Mike. His unfortunately broke on disassembling either this engine or the other one. So I've recreated that wooden one that he had here in, I believe it's oak. Should be quite a bit more sturdy. Now the reason for the holder that we just saw was to hold that crankshaft in place. Next we'll put on the crankshaft worm gear. This will drive the oil pump. Left-hand thread. Torque spec on this is 15 pounds. I have a feeling my torque wrench doesn't actually read in reverse. Probably not uncommon. I'm certainly putting on quite a bit of weight right now, so I would expect a click at some point. Just gonna have to call that good before I break something. So this pump has been dry for a while. We'll want to get it primed up. I don't have a syringe or some eyedropper or anything like that to get oil into this device, but I think I'm just gonna try to maybe pour some in and see what happens. What's the worst that could happen? It's certainly not a lot of oil in there. It's not that big of a housing. I will be adding oil into the system prior to running it, but we'll see if we can't just get a little bit in there now to, I don't know, add to the excitement. This is one of those reasons why when you are starting up a bike that hasn't been run for a while, you should definitely check that oil return back into the tank. Make sure it's actually coming back up to the tank. I guess this is gonna work. Either that or it's gonna make a giant mess when I turn it over to put it up onto the engine. But we'll catch that all on camera, so it doesn't matter. as I like to say, what's the worst that could happen? I should probably not look over at that blown motor, should I? We do have the nice gasket behind it. This, of course, is our infamous washer on the high pressure output, which goes into the timing cover. If that should fall into the dish like it just did here, I can tell you what could happen. That, of course, will get a new seal. I'm sure I will check it 18 times before we put that timing cover back on. These oil pump nuts are a modest 10 to 12 pounds. We'll set ours at 11. They may already be there. Doesn't take much. Mike has generously loaned me again his intermediate gear shaft holder. In the past, people have done different things like used an old timing cover that they've cut open. This is a little bit more elegant of a solution, especially if you don't have any extra timing covers you want to waste. You can see this is a nice thick piece of steel. It attaches over the shaft thusly and around the oil pump. And from there, you apply these screws into the cover. And you have to use these very thin washers as spacers. There are different size screws and spacers. I think it depends on which model Norton that you have. For the Commando here, I'm using the thinner spacers and the shorter screws. They don't need to be super tight here. They're just going to hold that shaft in place. That shaft doesn't have much support in it, and as you tighten down the camshaft nut, you can put a little bit of pressure on that shaft here, and this is what prevents any damage to that shaft. You don't want to pull that out of place. After all these years, OldBritts website is still the best resource for parts information. Even if you're in a place in the world where it's difficult for them to ship to, the information on their site is just incredible, and it's always been. And it's just great work from Fred and Ella. So for example, this blow-up parts drawing here is actually different from the one I have in the workshop manual. The workshop manual doesn't show that blanking plate on the 72s that we're looking at here. There was a change somewhere along in the 750 model line where this was actually filled in at the factory, but for these earlier ones, that I think was, I believe the rumor was that that actually was meant possibly for a starter. And you can see this boss here. We could probably see a little bit better when we didn't have the plate on there. This boss, I believe, was actually part of a prototype starter mechanism. Could be completely wrong. This was also a location for points at one point, and then on the earlier engines, I believe the magneto would have been there. The best part about the OldBritts site is that it clearly calls out the dimensions on all of the studs and screws in the entire bike. This is something you don't see in the parts manual, what you don't see in the Andover site. So for example, you can see that, you might not be able to see clearly, but this stud is called out 3/8 by 16 by 24. That's crucial information, especially if you're looking to buy the parts that you need and you're not able to get them from OldBritts themselves or even from Andover. Maybe you have a local supplier. So for these, obviously with the engine, there's a lot of non-standard BSF type bolts, but there are some things on here that aren't. So we're looking at the crankcase blanking plate and the hex-held bolts that hold that on. Again, what's great about the OldBritts site is that not only does it tell you the dimensions, but it also tells you the number required for a single engine. Again, this is information that you just don't see in many places. Great information for a Norton owner. So for this blanking plate, now in this case I bought a new one, which slightly differs from the original one. The original plates are a little bit thinner and they're dished in the middle. Doesn't make too much difference. My choice was to try to clean up the old dirty one or buy this one for a few dollars. I went with the cheaper route. You'll have to forgive me. What's very interesting is this is one of the mounting holes here. Now, according to the OldBritts site, it's also a 1/4 but what I'm finding is that it's actually slightly larger. Now, it fits a 5/16, but this isn't threaded for 5/16. At least I can't get this 5/16 to screw in there. As with everything, it's always a puzzle. Luckily, I was able to get my 5/16 coarse tap to go in very nicely and clean these threads up. May just been a factor of somebody putting maybe a too small of bolt in there and it's banged the threads up a little bit, but they are going to clean up very nicely here. Now, the parts book shows the bolt actually coming from the inside and going out, and then a nut being applied to it. I'm not quite sure. My guess is maybe they're trying to avoid a clearance issue on the back side here. Regardless, I think I'm going to go ahead and just mount it to the back if I can and see if that works, just to make it more presentable. Of course, these button heads are very non-standard. We do have a gasket that does go on the back. Again, with the revised oil drain hole, we should never see oil up that high, and if it is, it should just be flat splashing around. I actually have an extra gasket, so if we do have problems down the road, we should be fine. But I am going to put this on dry for now, and we'll check it later. If we do have problems, I'll take it off, clean it off, and apply some gasket on there. Again, with the reed valve that will be running off the back of the engine, we shouldn't have a lot of pressure up in the timing case here whatsoever. Now, this larger 5/16 bolt screw definitely does protrude into the timing case. There's nothing on the other side to worry about. I'll just lightly snug that up and make sure the other two are also tight. And we should be well sealed in that area.